Hey there, it's Justin Jocks with the Wedding Insider Podcast. Today, I have Michelle Yee, my friend and photographer from
Hi.
Toronto. She's awesome. And looking forward today, we're going to talk about how you can find an awesome wedding photographer and other things just to consider to make sure that you have amazing wedding photos. So, to get started, Michelle, what do you. Nah, no, we're not going to start like that. We're going to start with how did you start being a photographer?
Oh, how did I start being a photographer? Well, photography has been in my life for a really long time. My mother was a pretty avid hobbyist, so she was
Cool.
always taking photos of us. And I think I was probably around like 12 or 13 when she first taught me how to use her camera, which was the Canon AE1 program for any like photo nerds
Yeah,
out
I've got
there.
one of those too. Cool.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. I was really sad when she left it in the Philippines, but
Oh no.
yeah, that's fine. At least you can still buy them on eBay.
Mhm.
But yeah, so she made sure that photography was always around. She was the first person to, sort of teach me how to use a camera, and I have pretty much been taking a lot of photos ever since then. But I didn't really know I could pursue photography as a career until I was in my early 20s, which is a little bit late, I think. Yeah, but I just, I went on a trip to New York, and I know this sounds really cliched, but it was this transformative experience, and that was where I really saw, wow, people are actually like making a living doing whatever it is that they dream about doing. So yeah, so I went on that trip when I was like 23 or 24, and that's really when I started.
Cool. And then did you move into trying to shoot weddings? Is that kind of how was that transition?
Yeah, well, I was living in Edmonton at the time, and basically, if you want to be a photographer, you're shooting weddings there.
Ah,
So right away when I came back, I met like as many photographers as I possibly could, and I started working with photographers shooting weddings. So that was in 2000. And, I kind of grew up reading like Vogue magazine and Harper's Bazaar. And the whole dream of moving to New York initially was to be a fashion photographer. But, weddings is what I had available. So I just started shooting that right away. And then I guess it came a little bit later where I had already sort of established myself as like this new commercial and advertising photographer here in Toronto that um, I really started to focus on weddings. And it was basically when the recession came, the industry changed and people were just desperate to do any kind of work. And, I had what for me would have been like a pretty big client. Like I finally got hired by one of the Canadians, one of Canada's like big banks to shoot like a campaign for them.
hmm.
And they probably paid me like $500 for an ad that was going to be in China.
Whoa.
Yeah. And I just thought, and I talked to my other friends and one of them basically just said, look, if you don't do it, somebody else will. And I just thought, this is not really worth it for me.
Yeah, that's
Um,
crazy.
yeah. So at the time, like when I first moved to Toronto after photography school, and even when I was in school, I was shooting weddings. Like weddings, that was like, when you're an actor, like you wait tables. For me, as like a budding commercial photographer, you shoot weddings. Like it was just something that I had always done and I had did. So when the recession came and I was realizing that, this path that I was pursuing totally brought me no joy or satisfaction whatsoever. Um, it ended up being weddings that sort of saved me. Like I had friends who had asked me to shoot their weddings, and before I would have passed them off because I was like a hired gun for like a larger wedding photography company. So I would have just referred them to that company, but I was like, you know what, I'm not really doing much work. Yeah, I'll do it. And I was really surprised at how much like I really loved the work. Like it felt like second nature to me, and not having that person in between like me and my clients. Like before, as this hired gun, like I never met with the people. I just like would show up on the day of their wedding and start taking pictures. But now it was like, wow, I had like met these people. We were sort of acquaintances before, but now all of a sudden we're really friends because we had worked together throughout the planning. And in even in the act of actually shooting their wedding, I realized that I was only accountable to them and to myself. Like I didn't
Yeah.
us that I had to justify any sort of creative decisions, and that just made me feel like free to just do what I
Yeah.
wanted. And yeah, so that was like that first wedding under my own banner was in 2009, and I haven't looked back since.
Cool. Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's I think it's a much more intimate connection when you're that's a huge difference between hiring somebody like you or I, or a much smaller company, where you actually get to work with the person. And it is a really, it's like you're being, you're there for everything, especially a photographer. Like, I'm only there for the party, basically. You're there
Yeah.
for like the whole day, and the most intimate parts of the day.
Oh, for sure. It's mind-boggling to me to think that, usually for a wedding photographer, it starts with like getting ready, So in these people's lives, if you were ever to tell them you're going to take your clothes off and probably be naked for a moment and then put your clothes back on, and some stranger is going to be there taking photos, like most people would not be open to that at all. But
Yeah.
on the wedding day, it's accepted. So I think it's really funny that people sort of don't realize like this responsibility basically that they're bestowing upon this person. Like there's all sorts of, I know that, planning a wedding is really difficult, but um, you know, this is somebody that you're going to put a lot of trust in.
Yeah,
So I
for
think it's
sure.
really important to know who's going to show up that day. Like, I mean, of course, that company that I worked for was like really reputable, and all the photographers that they had working for them were super talented. But just that one thing alone of really not knowing who is going to be there the day of, like, that's a real act of trust that, when you work with a small business where you know who you're working with, like, I feel, some people are okay with delegating that and just putting their trust in that company to, take care of their interests. But for me, I think, it's something that's a real source of comfort of just knowing you're building a relationship with a person who's going to, be there on the day of and be there to take care of you afterwards as well.
It's the yeah, it's it's a crazy connection that you can form with someone over working with them essentially for one day. But
Yeah.
it's a part of the job that I really enjoy, is like meeting my clients beforehand, and really getting to know them, as opposed to just showing up the day of and having
Yeah.
someone taking pictures or playing music.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it wasn't really something that I had planned, but I love that we have so many new friends because
Yeah,
of the work that we do.
for sure.
Yeah, it's really rewarding.
Okay, so let's get going on some tips to help couples finding a photographer. So what is like, where should people start when they're looking for a photographer for their wedding?
Oh, well, there are so many places that you can look now. Like blogs are, a huge way for people to find photos. Personally, because blogs are like, they're global, you could be going on to Sell Me Pretty and looking at, these amazing photos, but they're of a photographer in Georgia.
Mm.
Unless you're getting married there, it's very difficult to replicate that. So I think people's best bets are, Google, and to, like Google your city or venue, places that you're thinking of getting married at, doing the image search and seeing what comes up and seeing what photos you gravitate towards. Of course, there are always like magazines, and they have blogs as well that you can access. There are some good Canadian publications that feature a lot of Canadian photographers, like Wedding Bells is one of them.
Mm.
Wedlocks is another if you're, if you're going to have a very styled wedding. But yeah, there's so many ways now that people can come across finding a wedding photographer. Wedding Wire is another one where they have a lot of really good people on there. So
Yeah,
yeah, a lot of different ways.
cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit. I think it can be a bit overwhelming too for people. I don't know. When I've talked to some brides, they feel overwhelmed at all the decisions that are possible out there. But those
Yeah,
are two good sites for sure. Is to try and, I mean, obviously you can go anywhere to get the inspiration, but if you're looking specifically for vendors, it makes sense to kind of stick within your country, especially like even if you're willing, even if you have the money to pay someone, it can be tough to travel and to take photos. I've had lots of people ask me to come to the States to DJ, and like
Yeah.
I can't. I'm not gonna take the effort to put in and get a visa and everything. It's just
Yeah.
it's a lot of work, and I think it's the same thing. And even if, I know some people might be willing to do it outside of a visa, but um, to try and find someone who's going to be able to actually work where you're where you're having your wedding makes the most amount of sense. So to start
Yeah.
with those couple of Canadian blogs, that's a good suggestion for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when you talk about like wedding photography, like I think I obviously I would love to travel with wedding photography, but even just for me, like the logistics of like being able to do your job really well under those circumstances are especially trying. Like even in Toronto, something that I do with all of my clients is because I tend to work mostly with natural light and because I'm more of a documentary photographer, that means that I need to come armed with as much information as possible. So I like to go to the venues at the time in which I'm going to be shooting, like beforehand. So I
Mm-hmm.
know like what I can expect with the light. Because I've been in lots of situations where when I was doing more editorial photos, they're like, you have 5 minutes with this CEO, and you're shooting downtown, like in the financial district, where you're really not even supposed to be shooting unless you have a permit in advance. So you're doing sort of guerrilla. And I showed up and I was there an hour early. And when you're in like the financial district, like the light changes there so quickly because you're basically in these canyons, right? So you'll have
Yeah.
a light that fits that one spot, but it won't be there 5 minutes later. And he was late for our shoot, and it was a total disaster.
Oh
By the
my
time he
god.
showed up, like all of the light, all of the places where I had planned on shooting him looked totally flat and boring. So when you're in a wedding like that and you don't have a chance for reshoot, not that you want to reshoot editorial jobs either, but there's so much more on the line.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're traveling, like that ability to really plan ahead and to know what you're getting into is it's definitely challenged.
For sure. Yeah, it's just. I mean, same thing. A little bit. Not as important for me, but I always would. Somebody could say that you could rent equipment or whatever and get around it, but I just like to know that I have equipment that works, that everything's going to be set up, that I just am familiar with the area. It's just traveling far outside just
I know.
seems difficult. I know people do it, but
Yeah.
it's
It's
definitely
not
nice.
really a work. It's not really a holiday.
No,
Like it's, if anything, like I just try to think of it as like, I'm just getting to work and it's somewhere different.
yeah,
But it is
for
work,
sure.
especially with travel weddings. Like you are working basically from the moment you arrive until you leave.
So what do you have any questions that if people have found a couple of people that they might be interested in, do you have any questions that they should be asking that um, they might not already know, like they might not already think about of themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think about, you'd sort of like ask me about like what could help people like decide on who's going to be a good wedding
Yeah.
photographer. And I feel like there's a lot of like wedding resources where they have all these different questions that you can ask photographers. Are you insured? Are you going to be the person there on the day of? Do you have like a list or a questionnaire or something that you can send me? And all of those things are definitely important. I think you need to, based on those, how the photographer answers, you can assess if this is a person that you trust or not. But it's also like things that you can't really ask them. Like whenever you email your photographer, how soon do they get back to
That's a
you?
good one. That's what I agree with that.
Because you're under a lot of stress planning a wedding. Not only is life busy with your work, your family obligations, whatever, throwing a wedding in there is a whole other animal. And when you have a vendor that you don't hear from for weeks, like that's not a comfortable feeling. So, for somebody like myself, I only take on a certain number of weddings because I know that I have to be on for the people that have booked me. So, whenever they email me, I want to make sure that I am like the last person in our thread to reply, even if it's just like, okay, got it, everything is great.
Hmm.
Because you just don't want to. I mean, my whole goal is just to make the process as easy as possible. So it's not only just helping them with like doing all of the photography side of things, but we've been at so many weddings that we have a pretty good sense of like what is realistic and what's not realistic in terms of timing. So if I see something that I think isn't going to work, I think maybe some vendors would probably choose a path of least resistance and just think, well, I don't want to bother them with that. So I'll just let somebody else deal with that. Or if they have a planner, like let that fall to somebody else's shoulders. But I really want to be proactive. And if I think that something's not going to work, I'm not going to wait till the day of to like, oh, I had a feeling this was going to be a disaster, but I just decided not to say something. Like I'll say something right away. So these are things that it's more in like the relationship building with your vendors. Do you really get a sense of like, do I have a good sense of dialogue with this person? Like, can I communicate easily with them? Not just like in the initial meeting, do they have really good canned responses to like, the questions?
For sure. Yeah, I think being even just how quickly somebody responds, that doesn't necessarily show you how they're going to be, but I feel like the people that are going to be most on top of checking in with you and making sure that everything's lined up they're going to respond to you relatively quickly. Like myself, I always try to be within 24 hours. I don't necessarily respond within an hour, but I sometimes do. But within 24 hours to me is a really reasonable time frame. But I know that I've heard from my clients that other vendors, like they haven't heard from them and they're like trying to kind of talk, or friends that have gotten married too, like they're trying to contact their vendors and like they will not hear from them for like 6 days, and it's like 2 days before their wedding and they're wondering if the person's going to show up at the wedding or not, and it can add a lot of stress for sure.
Totally, right? I mean, you're working with like, I guess this is that sort of the argument towards like going towards a bigger company, because we're working basically in an unregulated industry. So you're putting a lot of trust in these individual people that, really aren't accountable to anybody else but to you. So, you want to, like, I guess you could ask them how proactive are they? But
seriously, yeah.
In general, like,
I think that's actually not a bad, it's honestly, it sounds ridiculous, but it sounds like also almost a reasonable request, and just see what their response is.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that would be a good question, just to see, like, are you like the type of person who is going to anticipate needs?
Mm-hmm. Because my answer to that would probably be, I guarantee you a response within 72 hours, but I almost always respond within 24 or faster. Like that would be my response. Sometimes on a weekend when I have a couple of weddings, it can be tough to respond to emails, and that's generally the times I'm not responding super quick, but I still feel like it depends on the situation. If your wedding is 5 months away and you're sending me an email, I feel like you probably don't feel the need for a response. Where if your wedding was tomorrow and I saw an email come through, then I'd probably try and respond as quickly as possible. But
yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not saying that like I'm tied to my email, but
right. But you would probably have a similar response, where some people might not even have that response ready, where it seems like they're gonna care about that type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think being proactive, anticipating needs is actually part of my business. So
for sure.
So I guess that would be something that would be really worthwhile in asking your vendors in advance.
Cool. So what, like, photography more than anyone, I'm sure, other than other photographers, generally more than people that are going to be hiring a wedding photographer, I would say. What are like different, obviously people can just look at pictures and just get an idea of what kind of appeals to them, but what are the different styles that people can be looking for just from a descriptive standpoint? Like what's the difference between you, like I know there is a difference, but can you kind of describe that difference of what people can find in different photographers?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I have been to, like, I went to a wedding show yesterday just because a friend of mine was there, and we were just meeting other vendors, and my husband, who's a wedding DJ as well, like, he was talking to a photographer, and he was giving him his card. He's like, oh, but maybe you don't want my wife because she's a photographer. I'm like, oh, no, like, I don't have that perspective at all, because really, like, there are so many different styles of photography out there. Even when you say the sort of like blanket things like, I'm more of a photojournalist or I'm more of like a portrait photographer, even people who sort of associate themselves with that sort of style could have like huge variations in how that's translated. But I think in general, there are people who really focus a lot on like very styled wedding shoots,
Okay.
where they bring a lot of like elements in, like props and whatnot. These are people who would need a lot more time for the photos.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's people who say that their strengths are in candid photography, and they say they're more documentary or more photojournalistic. I mean, maybe it's not like binary, like it's this or that, but I guess those tend to be the extremes of like the more posed, more controlled versus like the not controlled and more sort of responsive types of photography.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but wedding photography in general, like there are so many different aspects of wedding photography that you kind of need to be like, you know, the jack of all trades in a sense. You need to have at least some skills in portraiture, some skills in photojournalism. You need to, now that people are really getting into like planning all the little details, like you also need to be like an accomplished still life photographer. So you wear a lot of different hats. Like I know a lot of really talented photographers who have like amazing like bodies of work who say they could never shoot weddings because it's just too stressful. And these are
Yeah.
people who are dealing with like, campaigns that cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. So, definitely, you definitely need to be very skilled in a lot of different areas as a photographer, regardless of like what you say you specialize in.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Um, mm, what what can people expect? Like, obviously, in anything you buy, there's different prices ranges for everything. You can buy a, I don't know, what's the cheapest car you could probably get? I'm not sure.
Oh, you could probably buy a car for
Like a,
$500 on Craigslist.
yeah, exactly.
Like, $1 million. I don't know, the McLaren. I guess is that like the new supercar.
I have no idea. I'm not a car
Anyways.
guy.
I'm not even know what is it.
Anyways, I should find a better analogy for future times I'm asking this question. But anyways, I'm sure everyone gets the idea. What's like the standard, or what kind of, obviously probably people can find a $500 wedding photographer on Kijiji. What
Yeah.
for a professional wedding photographer, where would the price range generally be? And probably people can also probably pay $100,000 for a wedding photographer. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that whole idea that you get what you pay for definitely holds true in photography. I mean, I think that there are instances where you can get really lucky and you can find someone who's talented but early in their career, and maybe, that'll only set you back $2,000 or $3,000. But, I've heard so many horror stories, even with people who have hired more expensive photographers, where, I mean, I guess this was in the days of film, but like I have a client of mine who said, yeah, like we hired our photographer and I was finally ready to make prints, like have like enlargements made, and he lost my negatives, and it had only been like 5 years. So, so there's a huge range,
yeah.
and she probably paid something like, $5,000 or $6,000 for her photography too. So but yeah, so it can really range. Like you can find somebody for the $2,000-$3,000 mark. You can find like really super talented people for around $5,000, and then
Yeah.
depending on like what else you want thrown in, whether you want like albums or you want them to capture more than just your day, but maybe your dress fitting too. It can just go upwards from there.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Um. Okay, so this is actually a good question. When you have a couple, what can they do to make sure that you are able to capture like the best photos? Like, is there anything? I'm sure there are things that they can do. And what are they?
Yeah, communication is key. Do not keep secrets from your photographer. I think that is like the number one thing. Because you have couples where like they want to surprise their partner on the day with something, and I think that that's amazing, but just don't keep that from your photographer. Even if you have to send them a surreptitious sort of email in secret, do that. I was at a wedding a couple of years ago where the groom in the middle of the reception decided or not, he didn't decide on impulse, but he had planned on serenading his bride. And for me at receptions, it's generally people sitting down at their tables. So after you get like the sort of like wide angle and some of those more standard shots, like generally you're just kind of, you've got your long lens on and you're just trying to get people's reactions.
Yeah, people eating isn't the most. It's not really worth taking pictures of either, right?
Like by that time, I've been carrying around all of my lenses and all of my gear all day. So now I'm just paring it down to just the one lens, because I think generally this is the lens that I'm going to be able to use to get people's reactions. And so all of a sudden he's singing and I'm like, oh my God, I don't have like the right, I was just limited in what I had available to me because I had only had that one lens on me, whereas all of my other stuff was off across the room. So, had he told me that he was going to be serenading her, I just would have had all of my tools at my disposal. So, like I still obviously managed to get photos of it, but I would have loved to have done so much more if I had known it's going to come. So that would probably be the biggest thing, is like just communicate everything to your photographer. Like whatever you think is maybe even not relevant to me, I would totally think is relevant. I like every itinerary that anyone does for them. Like the DJs, for example, like your itineraries are so detailed at the reception. It's like everything is broken down in like 2-minute increments, because it's like this song comes on, this speech, whatever. Like even though that may not be directly relevant to me, I still want to know what's going to happen so I can anticipate, so I can anticipate the evening and just
I've had lots of I make an itinerary for every wedding, and I know not everyone does, but I know that some other DJs too, or a planner does, or somebody. There's usually some sort of itinerary around, and it's just for those of you that are brides or grooms, like share those itineraries with all of your vendors, even if they don't seem like they matter. Because sometimes I have photographers coming up to me and it's not their fault. They just weren't told about what's going on, and like they're asking me what's going on, and then I have to either give them my itinerary or sit there and explain to them. They already should have that stuff. So just make sure that's a super good tip, because it is really important for us to know what's going on, and even the small things. Even for me, when I'm just playing background music during dinner, I like to know if you're planning on having people singing or whatever it is. And I'm sure Michelle would want to know, and every other photographer would want to know that stuff's happening too.
Exactly. I can't like stress that enough. That just giving as much information as possible. So,
Cool.
that is like the number one thing that people can do. And second to that, I guess, is just choose a venue that has great light.
Okay, cool. Actually, that's the next question. So when like you're a photographer and obviously very visual based. For those of us that don't think like you do, what should we be looking for when we're looking at a venue to make sure that our pictures are like really awesome?
Yeah. Well, like I think it's really important for people to pay attention to their first impression, like when they walk into a space. Like, does it feel really grand? Does it feel really like does it make you feel good being there? If you're in a place where you right away start thinking like, okay, well, I make sure I have to do that, I have to do that, I have to do that, then like it's at its very basic nature, it may not be like, may not be the best place. Because I feel like lighting is something that people just notice, or they get a sense of instinctually. It's
They
like
might not. Yeah, we might not notice it on our own, but
yeah. So I think you should just pay attention to what your instincts say.
cool.
Of how good a space is. Yeah.
Is there anything that, like styling wise, makeup wise, is there anything that you know of that helps brides, especially, I guess, look good in pictures?
I think the most important thing for me is that they feel comfortable.
Okay, cool.
Comfortable with how you look, you're not going to feel as confident. So, you know, when you're choosing like a makeup artist, for example, like I definitely recommend you do the test because you think that there is not too many ways that makeup can go wrong, but there are a million ways that makeup can go wrong. There was like a wedding show that my husband and I went to like a long time ago before I was even a wedding photographer, and he was like, "Oh, look, they're offering free makeovers. You should go have a makeover." And I went over and I was like, "Okay, have a makeover." And this woman literally sat me down and did not say a word to me for an hour. Like, she didn't talk to me at all. You know, I was the type of person who like I rarely wear makeup, so I had no idea what she was doing to me at all.
Oh my god.
And like an hour later, somebody was like, "Oh yeah, that looks really good." And she's like, "Yeah, you see, I told you would look great with this." And I was like, "You didn't actually say anything to me." And then after, when I got to see what I looked like, I was like shocked. I was like, "Wow, I look." The first thing that came to my mind was like, I look like a Chinese opera singer. Which is like totally not flattering at all because for men trying to be portrayed as women, and I felt like that. I was like,
Oh
I'm a
my
woman
god.
trying to look like a man trying to look like a woman. And yeah, it was horrible. It was really horrible. It was really, really embarrassing.
It's a good
And so,
story.
yeah, it was a good thing that she wasn't the makeup artist at my wedding.
Yeah, for
Seen
sure.
that, yeah, I would have been mortified. So, yeah, I mean, I am definitely a proponent of you just, I feel like the most beautiful thing about a person is like when they're smiling and they're happy. So,
Yeah.
as long
Okay,
as you
cool.
feel comfortable in what you're wearing and how you look, and you just feel like you've never looked better, then that is like all I need.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yes.
Um, one last question.
Okay.
I'm trying to ask like the same question to everyone. I forgot on the first interview. I didn't write it down, unfortunately, and you're number three, so you get the second try at this question.
All right.
And it's
Perfect.
just, can you share three like insider tips that you as a wedding photographer know that most people don't? And it doesn't even necessarily need to be about photography, but about a wedding. You know, like you get to see a lot of the day, and actually pretty much all of the day. So anything that you can think of that is gonna make somebody's wedding better, then let us know.
Ah, okay. Um,
It can be about photography too. So
Okay, okay. Well, I guess to reiterate communication.
yeah,
So, you know, share as much information as you have, even if you feel like you're bombarding your photographer if they're not replying, which they shouldn't. They, of course,
yeah.
but even if they're not, just send them like 10 different itineraries of the same day, whatever. So for me, you know, just give me as much information as possible. And so that's number one. I guess number two is, you know, I guess you know, it's really hard because weddings for a lot of people are, you know, it's something that they've thought about for a really long time. Even for somebody like me, like my husband and I were like, we're in the wedding business, but even when we got married, you know, there were like, it was a lot of stress just trying to plan it because there's all these expectations. You know, I didn't think at the time that it was necessary for my parents to invite like 50 of their friends whom I didn't know.
Hmm.
But, you know, now that my friends are starting to have kids and I'm developing relationships with them, I think, yeah, I want to be there when they get married. So, you know, I think that knowing that it's a lot of work and knowing that there's a lot of like expectations and preconceived notions about weddings, adopting the attitude that, you know, at its sort of, when it's distilled down, it's really a celebration of, you know, you making a commitment to somebody who is really important to you and sharing that with your friends and family. You can just keep that in mind. Like everything else can just fall to pieces, but as long as that one thing happens, then everything is going to be good. So all of your vendors are prepared because you bombarded them with itineraries. And then when shit hits the fan, oops, I'm sorry, I probably wasn't supposed to swear.
No,
But
that's
if,
right.
you know, stuff doesn't go the way you expected it, like, you know, just keep in mind, like, what it's really about. And then I guess the third thing would just be, you know, on the day itself, it really does fly by. You know, that whole idea of
Yeah.
like time flies when you're having fun, it is like exponentially fast on a day where it's like, oh my God, I'm surrounded by people I've loved. I can't believe I'm seeing all these people in one room all together. And so just make sure that on the day of, you just take a moment to really just absorb all of that.
I try and tell that to every one of my clients, just that it goes by so fast. Like, just try your best to realize that.
So just like one time during the day, and I think I'm gonna adopt the practice of like just like tell like even just instigating it and be like, okay, just want you to take a moment, take a deep breath, look around you, and just savor this
Cool.
because
Yeah, that's a good
this is a really
practice.
beautiful thing. Yeah, I think so. I think so because it's even for me, it's easy to get swept up, and it's like all of a sudden it's like 11 o'clock at night,
For
and
sure.
you know the day is almost done. So
Cool.
yeah, yeah. I hope
Thanks so
that.
much for sharing that info. I'm sure our listeners slash viewers will find a ton of value in that. That was really good.
Okay, I hope so. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. What can people do if they want to get in contact with you? Where can they
Oh,
find you?
they can go to my website, which is michelleyee.com. And, I used to hate that this is how you could spell my name, but it also fits really well with the Mickey Mouse song. So it's like MICHELLEYEE.com. So that's really easy. So you can go to my website. You can,
Our transcriber will appreciate
yeah,
your song.
I hope that they can write little musical notes. And you can also stalk me on Instagram, which is underscore Michelle Yee, but it's mostly photos of my dog. You're
Who's super
really into
cute, so I'm
she's
sure you'll love them.
yeah, there you go. And yeah, and then my Twitter handle is the same as Instagram, and I have a Facebook page, and new and exciting things are going to be happening there as well. So.
Okay, cool. And then I'm gonna put together some show notes with just links to kind of the sites that you've mentioned, links to your site,
Great.
whatever else, and it'll be indieweddingdj.com/podcast/Michelle.
Sweet.
And then yeah, so and then one other note is that if you're subscribed on iTunes and listening to this here, it would be amazing if you could give me a review if you liked what you've heard. I just want to be able to spread the word to more brides and grooms. So just the more reviews I have, the more likely they are to show my podcast to other people. So that would be amazing. Thanks so much, Michelle. I really appreciate your time. And I'm sure everyone else listening does too. And I really appreciate you being here.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Cool. Thanks.
Thanks.
Talk to you later.
Okay, bye.